Thanks, Matisse. Some good friends of mine have seated themselves right here in the front, I think, to either heckle me or make me nervous, and they aren't going to do either one, because I learned you never look at the front, you look at the back. And I can't see who you are in the back anyway. The subject this morning about change, for me anyway, is very apropos, because we have a new president coming in a few days who has promised change. I don't know whether he has a clue what that change is going to be, but I am certain of this: change will occur, whether he instigates it or the universe in which we live instigates it, because what I find interesting about change is that it's ongoing. Change is going on all the time, not just in a multiplying way, but exponentially. I just find as the older I get, and I don't think it's just because I'm old, the change just takes place more and more rapidly. What I'd like to do this morning is to give you a few examples of that change as I've seen it in my lifetime, and particularly in my own life, and then draw from that some principles about what do we do about change? How do we deal with change? Because I find that people are all over the map on how they approach change. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit this morning, but first let me give you some examples. Just in a general way, for instance, I've lived 75 years, so I've seen a lot of change. In the area, for instance, of communication, I grew up in my early years in a tiny little town on the prairies of northern Minnesota. In fact, it's about 35 below zero up there this morning. And I'm glad that I escaped from that at a relatively early age. But I recall that the telephone in those days was a big black box that hung on the wall. It had what they called a receiver on a cord that you took off and put up to your left ear. You cranked a crank on the right-hand side, and a voice from someone called Central would come on, and you would give her a 3-digit number. I can even remember that even as a child, our number was 121, and she would apparently at some central PBX stick a cord in, and that would get you to the place that you were calling. Now that's quite a contrast from today, from the cell phone that I carry around, and I have a very simple one that just makes phone calls, takes voicemail, and takes pictures. I'm about to head out next week to get a BlackBerry because I want to be able to get my emails when I travel. But look at the difference of that, and that isn't even to speak about the exponential changes that take place in between there. Transportation is another area. When I was a late teenager and now living in Salem, Oregon, I took a train from Portland to Minneapolis to go to college. That was a 40-hour train ride sitting straight up on a bench overnight, a couple of nights. Today I am privileged to serve on the board of that college, and I get there in about 4 hours by jet aircraft. And again, all kinds of exponential changes that took place in transportation to get us to that point. I also remember about the automobile that we ride around in today. When I was a child, small child, my dad loved cars, and he'd buy a new car every year or two. And the cars in those days, I remember him saying that Henry Ford said you can have any color you want as long as it's black, because every car was black. And they were all square boxes. What we call a trunk today truly was a trunk. It was a box that sort of hooked on the back of the car. The options that you could get in those days were a radio and heater. And where I lived, you obviously got the heater. I don't remember that we ever had a radio. But look at the contrast of that with the change that takes place virtually yearly now, and sometimes even more rapidly than that, in cars. Those cars also came in those early days with what they called a crank. There was a round spot in the dash of the car, and if the car didn't start with this thing on the floor that you pushed on and it cranked and cranked, you got out and manually cranked that thing. And I remember as a small child, my dad actually broke his arm because sometimes that thing would kick back on you. So look at the change that's taken place in cars, and again, exponentially over time with a lot of different changes taking place. There's also been a lot of change in my own life, and I relate some instances there just again to help you see some things about change and how changes come about. Sometimes we create them, sometimes we don't, and they come in a variety of ways. When I was 7 years old, my father, who was then up in this little small prairie town as a high school coach and teacher, determined that he'd make a change in the life of our family. And right after my 7th birthday in January, he left Minnesota to come out to Oregon to make a new life for our family. I look back on that now and I think there was a lot of risk involved there. He went down to Minneapolis and he rode out in a car with some people he didn't even know. He paid $8 to get a car ride out to Salem, where he happened to have a brother. And that changed our entire life. I went through that town a few years ago, and for days and weeks afterward, I could not get over the question in my mind of what if my dad had never made that change? Where would I be? What would I be doing? I knew I wouldn't be living in that goofy little town. As a matter of fact, just a very few years ago when I was in Minneapolis, I picked up the paper in the airport and saw that that town had been voted one of the 2 ugliest towns in the state of Minnesota. And I think I know what caused that, because if you remember some of the floods that took place in places like Fargo and Grand Forks, North Dakota, a half a dozen or so years ago, that town was purely a farm town, and the whole town was a large grain elevator, and I know what happened. The water got into that grain elevator, and if you understand it all about grain, and I'm not a farmer, it expanded, and I sure just blew that thing all over the whole little bitty town. But it haunted me about what if my father had never made that change. Later, as I went through my life and got into to college and then into graduate school, my goal in life was to be a college professor, to get a PhD in history and go on to teach college. But somewhere along the line, I got married and children began to come into my household, and I was struggling with college because I had to work as much as I could because my wife was a stay-at-home mother, and try to go to school on the side. And one day she sort of gently suggested to me, maybe there need to be a change. Maybe I need to go to get a real job. And so I did that, and I went to work for what was then the largest multiple line insurance company in the US, a company named Aetna. And they moved me around a lot, so I saw a lot of change going on around during those days. Finally, I ended up back in Portland, where I was a general manager of one of their 2 large divisions here. And but one day I reached the age of 40, and my pension was vested. In those days, that's the way that worked. And I began to think, why don't I consider making a change? Because I knew that company was going to continually move me, and eventually I would end up in Hartford, Connecticut, where I'd been once before and didn't want to be. I wanted to be here in this community, and I'm still here many years after that. So I determined that I would make a change, and I went from that huge company to a tiny little company then called Oregon Dental Service that, as Matisse indicated to you, had about $4 million in revenue. I learned about 6 months later it was broke. I was not enough of a financial man at the time to realize that going in, but somehow we survived all of that. And again, I look back and I say, what if I had not made that change? Because today Aetna really has no presence in this city. That company has changed totally from what it was, and I'm not even sure where I would be and what I would be doing had I not made that particular change. So again, changes tend to have a variety of impacts upon our life. As I led that company after a few years, it was an interesting place to be because dental insurance in those days was brand new. Most companies did not have it, and so it was a lot of fun. We were out selling against competition to companies who sometimes were having to put in a benefit they didn't want to, sometimes they did. But after a few years, that marketplace kind of got saturated, and we were into the typical phase of where we were either trying to hang on to our business or steal somebody else's, and that wasn't so much fun anymore. So we began to look around and said, well, how can we change that? And so we added to that business, first of all, a malpractice insurance company that even today covers about 85% of the dentists in Oregon. And then we added an insurance agency to help them with all of their business needs. And then we developed a software company in the days when, believe it or not, Bill, a 5 megabyte PC was a big deal. And eventually they came out with 10, and we said, well, why would we need that? and 5 was doing just fine. But we developed a software system that today is in several hundreds of dental offices all over the Northwest to help them with their billing and record-keeping needs, and that was a lot of fun. And it was something that was changed. It was changed for them because here we were in about 1981 when PCs were really first coming out, being involved in the whole change that was taking place in the world around. And then we saw an opportunity in the early 80s to move our business also into the medical insurance field, and that was a huge change. It changed that company from what today might have been a $200 million company to a $1 billion company. Just simply because we made that change, and we did it because it was fun and because it was a sort of a window of opportunity there in which we could do it. So again, change took place, and I look back today and wonder what would have happened had we not made those kind of changes. Certainly we wouldn't have had the fun we did, and the company would not be the company that it is today. Then into my life, just a very few years ago now, came something that caused a really dramatic change for me personally, because I was nearing the end of where I would have probably been totally leading that company, and my wife of about 45 years contracted not one but two forms of cancer, one of which was incurable. And so I determined to make a change and to go home and to spend my life, the rest of the time, with her, being her primary caregiver. She had been my primary caregiver in every respect as a stay-at-home wife and mother, traveled to different cities where I worked with me, and it seemed like that was the right thing to do and the only thing to do. And if you knew me well, you would know that that wouldn't necessarily be my choice in terms of how I might spend my time. In fact, I remember she said to me a time or two, well, of course, you really don't want to be here. And I remember saying to her, listen, if I didn't want to be here, you know me well enough to know I wouldn't be here. I would have hired somebody to do that. And I don't say that for self-aggrandizement, but to show you again where a major change took place, because now I went home and was completely cut off from what had been a 12-hour day, 5.5 days a week. Once she passed on into heaven, then again another change came, because now I was a single guy all by myself. I had never really been that way, because I had been married at age 19. I was a couple of years into college at that stage, so I'd never lived alone. So it was a whole big change for me. A lot of people asked me about that at the time, and I said, look, I have a good gardener, I have a good housekeeper, the restaurants are all open. I'm doing great. And some of you guys who know me well know that I was doing great. I had a lot of activity. I served on a lot of boards and traveled around the country for some of those are national boards. And so I was doing fine. But then another change happened, this one surely not instigated by me, because a lady whom I'd known for 30-some years and who lived clear across the country from me suddenly reappeared into my life. How all of that happened, I'm still not sure. But all of a sudden, this young lady, Gail, sitting over here smiling at me, became my wife now, actually 7 years ago today, as a matter of fact. And yeah. So, and again, if some of you have gotten to meet her a little bit this morning, if you had known my first wife, she was a tall girl from Southern California. This one is a short girl from Southern Georgia. And they are kiddingly tell some people who have not met her that, well, you like her, she's just exactly like Roxanne. And of course, she's about the exact opposite in terms of her background and where she comes from. But again, that's brought huge change into my life. I now have a new family whom I love dearly, and so that is the kind of change that has taken place. So a lot of different changes, and if you've caught them at all, some of them I instigated, some of them I didn't. And I'd like to take those instances now and see if I can bring to you a few principles of how I view change and how we need to deal with it. Because one thing I know for sure, my dad used to say when I was a kid, there are only two things sure in life, son, death and taxes. Well, my dad was wrong. There's a third thing, and that's change, because change is inevitable. There are very few things, if any other, in life that I think are inevitable, but change is. It's going to take place, whether we want to or not. And what I've been learning over the last few years is there are at least 3 ways that we can approach change that I'd like to suggest to you this morning. The first one of those is to resist change. And I suspect all of us resist certain change, but some people just flat out resist change. I have friends, for example, who worked with me, who just resist the cell phone, who until probably a year or two ago never even had a cell phone, and now carry it around turned off, turn it on if they're going to make a call, which happens maybe once a week for them. And so they've resisted that. And it baffles me. I don't understand how they resist. They won't go on the internet, they have a computer, but no, we don't turn that on. And I think that's pure resistance of change. I do not like those things, and I do not want to go there. And to me, I just have a hard time relating to that, because I happen to be one who you might have guessed loves change. Because if you saw in those different examples, you saw where I created change in most of those when I didn't need to. But it was just fun for me. And I just saw and do see change as always creating an opportunity. A second thing I think you can do with change is to just go along with it. And to some degree, I suspect we all go along with certain kinds of changes. Some of them we just have any control over, so you don't have much choice. but to go along with them. But there are also lots of instances where I think we could do differently. And we just sort of go along with it because, well, I really don't like it, but I don't want to resist it, so I'll just go along with it, and I'll just do what is required of me in order to sort of adapt to that change. For me, that's a difficult area. To me, I would rather do something different than that. And I think you can suspect that from the instances in my own life that I related to you. So the third area then I think about is to create change, to make it happen. And sometimes, as you saw in some of my examples, for instance, when I changed the face of Oregon Dental Service into what is today called ODS Companies, I did that totally by choice. Didn't have to do that. Had sister companies in states all around the country that we networked with. Most of them did not do that to this day. The state of Washington, state of California still have their Washington Dental Service, California Dental Service, just providing dental benefits. But to me, it was more fun and more interesting to make that change and to make that happen. So I submit to you that what I find to be interesting is making change. And I think there's sometimes when change is virtually foisted upon us and we still have the opportunity of how we're going to adapt to that change. How do we make that change work for us rather than to simply go along with it, resist it, drag our feet, okay, I'll do it because I'm being forced to do so. So I like the notion of making change happen. Now, as a matter of principle, however, I think that has to have a context. There needs to be some reason why we do that, and for me that relates back to what in the world am I on the face of this earth for anyway, and what is my real purpose in being alive in the first place. And for me, back when I was a student in college, I came to faith in Jesus Christ as my personal Savior, and that's a story for another day, but that led me to adapt a worldview that was based upon the Bible. So that when I look at change, I look at myself and say, what in the world is my purpose for being here anyway? And I try to be sure that those changes fit into that. I remember, for instance, when I made the change from Aetna to go over to Oregon Dental Service, I did something I really not had done a lot in my life, and that is to seek some counsel. And I went to my father and mother, I went to my father-in-law, I went to several others to seek counsel. Is this a wise thing for me to do? I'm leaving a sure thing here in a company that never fires anybody to go over to a company that's sort of a fledgling startup sort of a thing, and there was a lot of risk. I didn't see it as a lot of risk, but there was a lot of risk involved there. And I remember the one very close friend of mine's counsel was, well, why would you do that? Does it somehow increase your area of influence, if you will? And I got to thinking about that, and I said, yeah, it really does. And so that had a lot to do with my decision to make that change. The same thing was true when I made the change to expand the company into other areas, because I found that what that did was it enlarged that company to the place where I had the opportunity to be involved in a lot of business and civic affairs in Portland that I never would have been involved in before that. And that allowed me to let my purpose in life, if you will, move out into greater and broader influence. So there was a reason why those changes then were important. So I just want to submit to you this morning that when change comes, and I'm sure there will come some changes from our government that we won't like, and I for one will probably want to resist some of those, and yet resistance doesn't really accomplish very much. So for me, the least to do is to begin to try to adapt and make those changes work for me. But what I love, and I said to you earlier, I'm 75 years old and I'm still looking for change. I still love to make change happen. A couple of these guys from my church sitting down here know that, because I'm always looking for how in the world can we change and make something different happen. So as you wander on through life, I just submit to you, don't resist change. Welcome it as a friend, but always try to tie that back to something about what does that have to do with me and why I'm on the face of this earth in the first place, and what does that do to help me be more purposeful in the life in which I live. That's my message about change. I know change will occur even more rapidly in the next few years than it has in the past few, and I just encourage you to welcome it and look for ways in which you can make change that's meaningful. So with that, I'd take any questions if you have any, and I'm not sure this particular subject prompts a lot of questions, but if you have some, I'd be glad to take them. And Batiste will.
I'm just going to go ahead and repeat the questions for the sake of the recording.
Have you seen any change for the worse?
Have you seen any change for the worse?
In the world around me, lots of it. In my own personal life, I tend to not let that influence me. But yeah, I see a lot of change. I see a lot of moral change. Man, I mean, when I was a young person, no one lived together outside of wedlock. If a young woman got pregnant, she went off to grandmother's house in shame, in effect. I mean, that's a huge change that we see in the world around us. And I'm not making a judgment necessarily about that, although I have my own personal feelings about that, but I just think there's change all over the place. And I see changes taking place in our financial systems. I see lots more socialism moving into what I think a capitalistic system ought to be. I mean, there's just change everywhere. And I think that that's being compounded. I think it's moving faster and faster and faster. And I don't know where all that ends, because I just don't think it's moving at the same pace it once was. I'm one who, the happy days for me were in the 50s, like they were for anybody who lived then. I don't have any end to go back there. I've never been one to look back and say, let's go back. But I do find that this is a much more complex, difficult world in which to live than it was in those days, when I could have left my car sitting out here with a key in it. And this morning I wouldn't have dreamt of doing that. So yeah, a lot of change. And I think we're going to see a lot coming from our federal government over the next few months. I would be amazed if we don't. Now the question sometimes arises there, well then, should I resist that change? And again, I say no. I prefer to try to demonstrate with my own life and with my own associations and places where I am that there is an alternative to some of these kinds of things. To stand and condemn them and speak against them doesn't do a whole lot. But to try to demonstrate a different way of life, if you can gather a few people, I used to say a dozen people can change the world. And I think that may be true, if people really wanted to. I don't know whether that answers your question, but boy, change everywhere. And I think we've only begun to see it. Some good too. I mean, I'm not suggesting all the change we're seeing around us is bad. I love the fact I'm going to be able to get my email off of a telephone. That's great. I don't have to pack that laptop with me anymore every place I go. So.
But how do you help get those people that are resisting change on your side and moving with your programs?
When I was working, obviously when we would make changes, there was all over the map as to how people responded to those changes. What I learned quite a while ago was that oftentimes the reason why people had a hard time and sometimes resisted change was because they were fearful of it. They were afraid of what did that mean for me? Was I going to be able to make that change? Would I be able to do that successfully in a way that my boss would allow me to continue to work? So that what we always tried to do in a work situation is where we made changes was to be sure that people were well prepared, that you didn't just spring a change on them, that you talked about that change, that you recognized that people's ability to adapt to change is all over the map. I mean, I happen to be one because I love change and I adapt pretty quickly to change. But a lot of people don't. And I think that what you have to do is to understand that and realize that just because you're ready to charge out in another direction doesn't mean that everybody who has to go with you is on the same page that you are. So it takes a lot of preparation. If you had a large staff, when I left down there we had about between 400 and 500 people, and if you had a department with 50 people and you were going to make change, you couldn't just do that like that. You had to be sure that people knew it was coming, knew when it was coming, were prepared for it, had all the training that they felt that they needed, and again, that was different for all individuals. So one of the things I've learned about change is people all adapt in a different way and at a different pace. So you just have to understand that and be sure that you prepare that. Thanks for listening. Appreciate it.